So welcome everyone to Martin Luther University College's 2025 Global Advocacy Award event. I'm so glad that you can be with us, and welcome to those of you who are joining online as well. As we begin this evening, it's important for us to recognize and acknowledge the land on which we are gathered. Martin Luther University College is located on the Haldeman Tract, the traditional territories of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. This territory is part of the two-row wampum, friendship belt, and dish with one spoon treaties commending all to live in peace, stewarding and sharing the resources of this land. The Haldeman Deed of October 25th, 1784, signed by the British and the Six Nations, secured 6 miles on each side of the Grand River from Lake Erie to its head for the Haudenosaunee people for their enjoyment forever, as compensation for their service to the Crown and for lands lost during the American Revolution. This land is now home to people from other First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities. This land acknowledgement, it signals Martin Luther University College's commitment to the work of truth and reconciliation, seeking reparation for the harms of colonization. We give thanks to the First Peoples for their sacred work of caring for this land, and we commit to ourselves to walking alongside of them in this work and contributing to this care. We also express our deep gratitude to the land itself, our first mother, who provides for us in our journey from cradle to grave. So as we begin this evening, let me say a little bit about the Global Advocacy Award. Luther established the Global Advocacy Award to recognize both national and international recipients for their outstanding achievements and contributions to the local and global communities. The Global Advocacy Award is not merely an accolade, it's a recognition of a lifetime of work that champions the values that we strive toward: justice, peace, and the protection of the planet. This award honors individuals whose profound engagement with local and global issues exemplifies a commitment to creating a more inclusive and compassionate world, whether through social justice advocacy, environmental activism, humanitarian aid, or fostering international cooperation. The recipients of the Global Advocacy Award are the trailblazers in the pursuit of these ideals. The Global Advocacy Award is funded by the Frimmer Fund through Charitas. The Global Advocacy Award carries the weight of significant support from organizations deeply committed to driving global change. The Frimmer Fund, named in honor of those who believe in a compassionate and just world, provides the financial backing that makes the Global Advocacy Award a reality. Through Charitas, this support is channeled to empower exceptional individuals whose work has a ripple effect that extends far beyond their own borders. The significance of this partnership lies in the alignment of Frimmer Fund's purpose to promote and support initiatives that advance the cause of social and economic justice. Charitas, with its vision as an innovative leader at the intersection of faith, finances, and philanthropy, ensures that the impact of the Global Advocacy Award will be felt in meaningful ways, offering recipients not just recognition, but also the resources to further their important work. The Global Advocacy Award is more than an honor. It's a celebration of the spirit of global citizenship. It brings together individuals from diverse backgrounds and causes, all united by their shared commitments to foster positive change. With the Frimmer Fund and Charitas as its supporters, the award ensures that the legacy of those it honors will continue to inspire generations of leaders, activists, and advocates working to make the world a better place for all. I'm very grateful for the support of Charitas and the Frimmer Fund for this award. Catherine Smith, the gift advisor for Charitas, is with us this evening, And Catherine is available to share more information with anyone in attendance on the importance of donor gifts and the impacts of these gifts on such things as tonight's award. Along with the physical award, the recipient receives $1,000 to contribute to the organization of their choosing and agrees to come and make a public presentation on a topic of choice. And this year's award winner is choosing to give their $1,000 to the Canadian Council of Churches. Each year, nominations for the award are invited, and a committee reviews these and decides which applicant best embodies the values outlined for the award. This year, we had a number of excellent nominations, and the committee had a challenging time to make their decision. I want to thank Dr. Das Sidney, there you are here, for his nomination of this year's award winner. And now I would like to invite Reverend Dr. David Frimmer to introduce this year's award winner, Pastor Peter Notabloom.
Thank you, Christine. Well, it's my personal pleasure and a distinct honor to introduce this year's 2025 recipient of the Martin Luther College Global Advocacy Award, Pastor Peter Notabloom. I've known Peter for over 25 years, and for the sake of full disclosure, I was served as the chairperson of the CCC's Commission on Justice and Peace when we hired Peter as its associate secretary in 1999. And I might add, one of the best decisions we made. Peter earned his Bachelor of Arts degree in Philosophy and Business Administration from Dordt College University in Sioux Center, Iowa in 1980. He obtained his Master of Arts degree in European Studies from the Catholic University in Leuven in Belgium in 1989. From 1996 to 1999, he pursued graduate studies in Christian political theory at the Institute for Christian Studies in Toronto. In 2007, he completed a postgraduate diploma in Dialogue and Negotiation from Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, British Columbia. Peter has lived and worked in North America, Europe, Africa, and China. He speaks 4 languages fluently, including Mandarin Chinese, and has competency in 4 additional languages. As I was telling Peter at dinner, that was one of the things that jumped out for me from his resume when we hired him back in 1999, someone who had that kind of life experience. Now, as we honor Peter, we also want to express our appreciation to his wife, Jeanette. We recognize that Peter's commitment to his work has often meant time away from you and from your family, and we want to thank you for your support of his work and also for raising such a nice guy. He turned out okay. How would I describe Peter's life's work? Peter is a skilled and dedicated ecumenical and multi-faith diplomat who adeptly brings together, coordinates, and inspires those committed to an engaged public faith. At the time Peter was hired to work for the CCC, for the Justice and Peace Commission, much to the chagrin of some of us, several members of the council wanted to have less public justice-oriented presence, or have a less justice-oriented public presence. For more than 2 decades, Peter skillfully and sensitively navigated an accommodation between these twin tectonic pressures of the faith and order-minded on the one hand, and the life and work justice-oriented activists on the other. Now, the comedian Woody Allen once said, quote, "If 90% of success in life is showing up, the other 10% depends on what you're showing up for." Throughout his career, Peter Notabloom has not only shown up, but has also made significant contributions that have shaped defining moments in our lives, both as a nation and within our churches and faith communities. Peter notably has been involved in numerous initiatives, too many to mention here, so I'll just mention a few highlights. He played a key role in the 2000 Jubilee Initiative, which saw 650,000 Canadians, the largest petition in Canadian history, calling on the Canadian government to cancel the debts of the 50 of the world's most heavily indebted poor countries. He actively promoted what churches termed an economy of life. One of his initiatives led to the establishment of an ecumenical Canada-US Just Trade Charter, which has become even more relevant, need I say, in the light of Donald Trump's tariff war. He encouraged the work of the Canadian Council of Churches Ecumenical Health Network, which developed a Canadian health covenant to guide healthcare reform. Roy Romano made this the first recommendation of his 2002 Royal Commission report on the future of healthcare. Peter organized and chaired the Canadian Ecumenical Anti-Racism Network that helps churches raise issues of racial justice and reconciliation. He led the church's opposition to the Canada-US Safe Third Party or Safe Third Country Agreement, which fails to respect the rights of refugees seeking sanctuary in Canada. He supported the church's opposition in the Supreme Court to Harvard's attempts to patent a life form known as the oncomouse. He also encouraged the CCC's biotechnology reference group to explore the theological and ethical implications of biotechnology, including topics such as synthetic biology, the future of food, genetic privacy, nanotechnology, end-of-life issues, stem cell research, and more recently, questions surrounding artificial intelligence. Peter has led initiatives against sexual exploitation and human trafficking in Canada, as well as international ecumenical efforts to address HIV/AIDS. He has spearheaded the Canadian Interfaith Conversation that represents 62 faith communities and organizations advocating for pluralism and a positive role for religion in Canadian society. They host a biennial Our Whole Society conference, which I believe is scheduled for in a week's time to take place in Winnipeg. Importantly, Peter has been involved in various just peacemaking efforts, including opposing George W. Bush's, that's Jr., war in Iraq. Prime Minister Jean Chrétien admitted that Canada stayed out of that war largely because 40,000 Canadians signed a petition opposing it that was spearheaded by Project Plowshares, a project of the Canadian Council of Churches. Now, Peter and I must admit, have shared many memorable moments together. I was telling him tonight at dinner, one of the ones I remember is driving back from Ottawa. Peter's so committed to the work, sitting in the back seat, working on his emails, and this was at a time before data plans were a thing. And there he was in the back seat, skillfully hopping between all the free Wi-Fi hotspots on the 401. And when he was not able to connect, he would talk to us, and then he'd precisely go back on. I also remember our various priority-setting meetings, where the walls were a rainbow, a virtual kaleidoscope of colorful Post-it notes. You know the little ones I mean. They were stuck everywhere, each one representing a priority. And in the end, it was only Peter who could disaggregate all of that and organize them into a coherent strategy for the rest of us. Another vivid memory is from our time in Mexico, where he felt right at home, meeting with indigenous corn farmers from Chiapas on the one hand, and senior officials at the Canadian Embassy on the other. Albert Einstein, arguably the world's most famous scientist, once said, "The world is a dangerous place to live, not because of people who are evil, but because of the people who don't do anything about it." So I invite you to join me now in welcoming someone who has done something about it and has truly made the world a better place. The 2025 recipient of Luther College's Global Advocacy Award, Peter Notable.
So I didn't know that I was preparing some remarks for a community of peers. This feels to me like just exactly what that Ubuntu expression of theology, I am because you are. Whatever I say tonight, whatever kind words David has said about the work is our work. We've all been in it together, and it's a real privilege to be here, and it's only because of you, your collegiality, your prayers, your support in many, many different ways. So I was asked to prepare some remarks, though. So I was wondering how to, what to focus on, and I decided to just name a few sources and stories of inspiration of Canadian faith communities in action. This isn't a research or academic paper, but more kind of a personal reflection, reflecting back on many of the things that David's already highlighted. So I'm very grateful. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here and for the award. Let me just check. I'm a soft-spoken person and I can get emotional, so I just wonder if it's carrying as well as it should, or if I should move the microphone in a little better. How about if I move it in better? Is that, I see Henriette, you're noticing yet still? I'll bring it right in. There, now we're sounding better. Right here. So from creation to redemption and restoration, it all begins and ends with gift and grace. I've been especially interested these days in the economy of grace, what recent Catholic social teaching calls gratuitousness, the underlying abundance of creation and the economy, and its character of having been gifted by God, the Creator. So it's neither transactional or even transformational, but instead an underlying quality of a free gift, of free grace, that is the underlying way of the economy, the norms of our household, of the earth, and the cosmos. This spiritual teaching is not unlike traditional indigenous teachings about the nature of creation as gift, abundance, and mutuality. These stories and these sources and stories of inspiration all begin and end here. This is my bookend. So thinking about sources, one might think about role models. And I imagine that we all have role models, sources of inspiration who have lit our fires to act and live for justice. Mine are, beside Jesus, the Trappist monk Thomas Merton, who wrote about the hidden ground of love. Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who started each day of the South Africa Truth and Reconciliation Commission in prayer, a spiritual practice, privately. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, of course, who said that the arc of the universe bends toward justice. And the nature writer Barry Lopez, who wrote in his stories about nature and culture how to pay attention. But also I'd like to pay tribute to a few of the less famous and more personal role models who lit my fire for justice. I'm thinking in my 20s, it was Wang Zhengfei, a friend in China who first unveiled for me the effects of an unjust hierarchical system when he explained to me he had no choice at all in his career and was simply obliged to follow the instructions of his party leader against his personal convictions and hopes. So devastating. In my 30s, it was Geneviève Spock and Daouda Giambe, colleagues from Niger, West Africa, who first taught me how to truly listen to farmers, housewives, traders in traditional subsistence communities in the Sahel. In my 40s, Reverend Jennifer Henry, ecumenical colleague, who by her actions and convictions and voice conveyed the Canadian ecumenical justice, symbolic, and organizational landscape to me. Who are your role models? Take a moment to reflect who lit your fire for justice. Remember them for a moment in silence and say a prayer. And after a minute or two, I'll just invite you to say quietly their names. Let's remember them. Give voice to their names. Who were they? Mm-hmm. Thank you. There we go. Oh, back again with the sound. Thank you. I want to start with Iraq. So in the wake of September 11, war drums were beating to invade Iraq, not a particularly virtuous state, but not at all connected to the perpetrators of the 9/11 attacks. With one child on my shoulders, another in a stroller before me, walking side by side with my wife Jeanette, we protested in the Toronto streets against Canada participating in a military invasion of Iraq. We walked as community of faith alongside many civil society organizations and unions. Ernie McGeer at Project Plowshares, Mary Corkery at Kairos, ecumenical leaders, and many others were persuaded that this was an international military intervention that Canada should not participate in, but that Canada instead should prepare for peace. We, that is the Canadian Council of Churches and Project Plowshares with Kairos, led a unanimous effort for church leaders to write to the Prime Minister saying, we call for peacemaking. We reaffirm our rejection of war on Iraq. We call on the Government of Canada to refuse any military involvement in such a war, and further call people and governments everywhere to redouble the pursuit of peacemaking. As David mentioned, after Prime Minister Jean Chrétien decided not to join the invasion, he let slip in private conversations with a church leader that it was the banks and the churches who persuaded him not to invade or not to join the invasion. So for me, this is a story of Canadian faith communities in action that deserves more research and retelling. Here's another one, the Jubilee 2000 debt cancellation campaign. Just outside the Cologne Cathedral in Cologne, Germany, where the G8 summit was being held in June 1999, was a glass room filled to the rafters with millions of signed and completed petitions. As David said, 640,000 of those signatures were from Canada, and that means 2% of the population in Canada. 1 in 50 Canadians had signed that petition. We were standing with campaigners from around the world in a circle around the G8 meeting room, reminding them, calling on them, to cancel the debt of heavily indebted poor countries. One of the goals of the Jubilee campaign was to see Jubilee resources available in every local church, parish, congregation in Canada. The campaign surpassed their goal for distributing those education and advocacy resources. I think there are 13,500 worshiping communities in the Canadian Council of Churches today, so that's a lot of people to connect with. Has there been a larger, more successful faith-based campaign in Canada, or any other kind of campaign in Canada? The Canadian Ecumenical Jubilee Initiative was a multi-year campaign whose main focus had been to advocate for canceling the debt of heavily indebted poor countries. The Canadian government changed its policies regarding finances to extend grants rather than loans, and did indeed cancel millions of dollars of debt owed to Canada by countries who would never be able to repay them. This is a story of Canadian faith communities in action that deserves more research and retelling. Here's another. After the October 7 Hamas raid in Israel, and the subsequent demonstrations and counter-demonstrations where interfaith relationships in Canada were sorely tested, and still are, representatives of Canadian faith communities traveled to Ottawa to appear in the press gallery to stand together against hate based on religious identity. The Office of the Prime Minister had invited leaders of Canadian faith communities to a meeting with the Prime Minister to speak about how to stand against and speak up against hate based on religious identity. That first planning meeting didn't work out. But the second attempt at organizing a meeting did work out. Last December, 9 Canadian faith community leaders were seated around the cabinet table, each sharing stories of fostering hope and standing against hate, with the Prime Minister encouraging us to do more. When one of the faith leaders veered off script and very movingly asked for the Prime Minister's forgiveness for his community, for members who had taken part in profane demonstrations against the Prime Minister, the mood and tone of the meeting was transformed from an advocacy session to authentic interpersonal dialogue, community, and shared purpose. We ended the meeting in the cabinet room by pushing aside the chairs, standing in a circle, holding hands, and reflection and prayer. This too is a story of Canadian faith communities that in action that deserves more research and retelling. Let me go on. Truth and reconciliation. I remember blankets spread out on Parliament Hill in front of the Peace Tower. We had just finished listening to Cindy Blackstock, child advocate extraordinaire, at St. Peter's Lutheran or Christchurch Cathedral in downtown Ottawa. I can't remember which one. And we walked over to Parliament Hill. Kairos blanket exercise facilitators spread out blankets on the lawn, read the story of colonization, marginalization, exclusion, and attempted assimilation while we dramatized those effects with blankets that left us standing on the tiniest slivers of land. To retell that story on the grounds of Parliament Hill, with bystanders and tourists joining in, with MPs pausing to ask questions, there was a profound feeling and experience of working to reconcile colonial histories, reconciliation histories, and where people of faith belong. This is but a tiny part of a longer history of engagement with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission on Indian Residential Schools, the hearings, the marches, the survivors' testimonies, the witnesses, the expressions of reconciliation, the calls to action that still call us forward today. A story of Canadian faith communities and actions that deserves more research and retelling. Looking at you, John. I shouldn't do that, should I? Climate. Sometimes we've had important conversations about Canada elsewhere. In 2015, the Church of Sweden invited Canadians to come to Storfors in Sweden for a pan-Arctic conversation on the future of life in the Arctic, the impact of climate change, Indigenous and religious perspectives. There, in the European North, we heard about the changes and challenges due to climate change in the American North, affirmed that climate justice for the Arctic is a spiritual issue, and the power to change comes from spiritual sources. That all the land, all the cosmos is sacred, a sacrament infused with meaning. We said that the gift of Indigenous worldviews enhances the possibilities of transformation through the acknowledgement of soul and spirit in all created life. We ask that faith communities and people everywhere rededicate themselves to stand in solidarity and support the peoples in the North who are now already survivors and leaders in responding to climate change. We were working to contribute to the deliberations leading up to what became the Paris Agreement, the legally binding international treaty on climate change, at least in theory. The appeal said that an essential framework and guide for political action on climate change and Indigenous peoples is the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the 2015 World Conference on Indigenous Peoples Outcome Document. The Paris Agreement explicitly included reference to the rights of Indigenous peoples. This, too, is a story of Canadian faith communities in action that deserves more research and retelling. And I'd like to invite you to tell a story at your tables. Turn to each other, to your neighbor. Remember one story of Canadian faith communities in action that has inspired you. A couple of minutes at your tables. I'll call you back. Okay, friends, come on back when you're ready. Okay, friends, come on back. Thank you for sharing. I wish we're at all your tables to hear those stories. Great, thank you. Thank you for taking a moment to share some of those stories. They're important. Your stories, my stories, your role models, my role models. Thank you. So I wonder if it would be possible to tease out of your stories and my stories and my sources, my role models, and the ones you mentioned, some sacred touchstones from Scripture and the life and practice of faith communities, and to describe them. The complexity and breadth of teaching in our faith traditions is a tremendous asset and sometimes a tremendous burden. I feel that, many of this will sound familiar to you, and you'll say, yeah, he's telling me what I already know. And that I welcome that. But here are a few sacred touchstones or principles that I've noticed are indispensable for Canadian faith communities in action. Human dignity. Seeing human beings as having been created in the image of God, that is, actors, as sparks of the divine, as Calvin says, or as Quakers say, honoring that of God or that of the divine in others, is pure gift. Human dignity, which makes co-creation possible, is a gift of God. That gift of dignity grounds our respect for one another, that each individual we encounter and desire to co-create with is a person of incomparable worth. In my view, human dignity is the foundation of all human rights, whether they be the right to life, Indigenous rights, civil and political rights, economic, social, and cultural rights, women's rights. An examination of the writers of the UN Declaration of Human Rights reveals important contributions from faith leaders, of course. So human dignity. Here's another. The sacredness of life, that the earth is the Lord's. So if, as Psalm 24 says, the earth is the Lord's and all that is in it, the world and those who live in it, then it's not mine, it's not ours, it's not yours, it's not Canada's, not anyone else's. We don't have the right to appropriate the earth for personal or corporate profit, to trash or pollute the earth, or to militarize it. This faith insight is the great leveler. Whether church leaders are writing about caring for the earth or that nuclear weapons are an abomination and against the will of God, church leaders are fond of quoting this psalm. Of course, this dovetails with what I quoted earlier from the Storforsen appeal in Sweden, that all the land, all the cosmos is sacred, a sacrament infused with meaning. Because we're in another Jubilee campaign, I'm going to mention Jubilee as another principle or sacred touchstone. Debt cancellation occurs in the Jubilee story when every 50 years liberty was proclaimed throughout the land to all. In that 50th year, everyone returned to their home and family, their starting point. The reset wasn't merited. It simply occurred on clock time. No one earned a fresh start. Instead, it was built into the passage of time, and it applied to everyone. The biblical story sets out an important economic principle of recurring equality. This principle shows up in the Jubilee story in Leviticus and in Jesus' first sermon when he said he came to bring good news to the poor, to proclaim release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, letting the oppressed go free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor, the year of Jubilee. I think it's important to remember that the Jubilee story is about the cancellation of debt, but also about the cancellation of wealth. There's nothing sacred about the accumulation of wealth. Jubilee is a story of restoring abundance for all. Another sacred touchstone, of course, the Jesus stories, turning the tables. So whether overturning the money tables in the temple, or healing on the Sabbath, or meeting the Samaritan woman at the well, or the faith of the Canaanite woman, Jesus was revolutionary. The life and stories of Jesus are an endless well of inspiration for turning power upside down, for breathing life into stale and stiff laws, showing mercy, standing with the excluded, demonstrating the good news. The gospel stories of Jesus are especially powerful when working to undo racism, welcoming refugees, offering healing, fostering hope. And here's one more. We are all one body. As it says, if one member suffers, all suffer together with it. If one member is honored, all rejoice together with it. The text reads like a poem, but the Apostle Paul, in his letter to Corinthians, gave voice to solidarity, our belonging in the body of Christ, and that we are all individually members of the body of Christ. Whether advocating for equal, accessible, comprehensive, portable public health care in Canada, or building community across differences, or inclusion and justice for all, it has always been good to be reminded that one member of the body can't say to another, I have no need of you, or that members of the body that seem to be weaker are in fact indispensable, so that the members may have the same care for one another. So I think these, that we're all one body, that the Jubilee principle, the Jesus stories, the sacredness of life, human dignity, those are 5 starting points or principles that I think can be easily teased out of some of those stories. As I've done before, I want to pause here and just give you a moment of silent reflection. Which of these principles or sacred teachings resonate especially with you? Just a minute or two of silence. We've been talking about principles, and we could also talk about practices. So in addition to principles or sacred touchstones, faith communities in Canada also have practices that have guided their approach to organizing. These are recurring practices of Canadian public ecumenism and increasingly also Canadian multi-faithism. Here's one. Put the other first. Follow the lead of the ones most affected. Be discipled by them. When working on poverty, start with the lived experiences of people experiencing poverty. When working to end sexual exploitation, start with the voices of the trafficked. When working to understand conflict, start with the victims. I think this is true both individually, but also collectively. Here's another. Practice, prayer, liturgy, spiritual practices, acts of worship, true to our faith and faith communities is indispensable. Our faith comes to life when we actually be the change we seek in the way we organize. The benediction offered at the close of worship sends us, go in peace to love and to serve. Another practice, remember rightly. Pay attention to history, live truth and reconciliation. Canada is not one nation. Canada has many stories, many histories. Christians too have many traditions, churches, stories, and histories. To be intercultural means we need to speak one another's histories. Ecumenical and multi-faith communities in Canada are intercultural ones. We have a special responsibility to know and to learn and to be in relationship with the stories of the Indigenous peoples in this land. It's only by paying attention to history and one another's stories, living truth and reconciliation, that we can live with integrity. And here's a last practice that I'm mentioning, pluralism. According to its charter vision, the Canadian Interfaith Conversation represents the desire to advocate for religion in a pluralistic society and in Canadian public life. In a world where interfaith and multi-faith relationships are increasingly relevant, the commitment to pluralism, the advocacy for pluralism, the understanding of what pluralism is becomes more and more important. Pluralism should not be identical treatment for all, but it certainly is advocating for and practicing inclusion for all voices to be heard in the public square and to speak up for our neighbor's voice. So I think this is the way faith communities are in action in Canada. They're not histories, nor are they hagiographies, stories of the saints, to honor those who have gone before. These stories are still unfolding. These themes still inspire, they still drive, they still motivate Canadian faith communities. As you might tell, I'm coming to the end, but I want to take a quick detour. What I have described is different from Christian nationalism or other forms of religious nationalism. In Canada, the characteristics of Christian nationalism I see are that Christians come first. The starting point for political action is not the community, the public, or citizenship, but instead the well-being of Christians and what advances a culturally defined Christian way of life. What I also notice is for Christian nationalists is that the end justifies whatever means. Whether flying profane flags, using divisive language online, or overlooking some moral failings in pursuit of other moral outcomes, Christian and religious nationalists prioritize achieving a political outcome at whatever cost. There's also often a feeling of persecution that motivates. There's no golden age of thriving faith communities we can return to. Christian nationalists feel they experience unfair and persistent persecution when others don't share their views or when their views have become a minority. Differences in convictions and societal norms do not equal persecution for the sake of one's beliefs, difficult as it may be to live out those beliefs and faith with integrity in all aspects of our lives. Another characteristic is a kind of unapologetic conviction about the religious rightness of their views and policies. It's one thing to believe one knows the answer, it's another thing to impose the answer on others. Christian nationalism is fundamentally anti-democratic and frequently identifies with a group circumscribed by a nation, race, or ethnicity, or a confessionally prescribed faith group. That's one that hits particularly close in my own Reformed tradition these days. As Alison Carr from the Presbyterian Church in Canada puts it, Christian nationalism has three common elements. The first one is believing that one's nation was explicitly founded on Christianity and should remain that way. The second element is believing that the nation should be governed by a set of selected quote-unquote Christian values. The third one is believing that anything diverging from the narrow values it claims are quote-unquote Christian is a sure sign of the work of evil. These beliefs are often accompanied by the conviction that one's nation has a special role to play in God's plan, and that if you're not explicitly for that plan, then you're against it. This is part of Christian nationalism's power, says Alison Carr. It portrays itself as specially anointed, pursuing a holier, more true form of Christianity. But Christian nationalism does not now represent the way faith communities in Canada operate. Even if many strong elements of Christian nationalism appear and are profiled in social media, on public media, and in social movements such as the Freedom Convoy. Canadian faith communities, though, must continue to organize, to remember, to research, to tell our stories, and live into our calling to love and serve our neighbor, to put others first, to work for peace, to care for creation, honor life, foster hope. So as you go from here, let me invite you to join in and support three examples of Canadian faith communities in action today. Jubilee, turn debt into hope. The campaign is seeking 100,000 signatures this year. Visit the campaign website, share the petition campaign digitally, do the old-fashioned thing of printing out the petition and bringing it to the next worship service you attend. Truth and reconciliation. Deepen, honor, connect, love and examine the history, life, and witness of Indigenous peoples in Canada, persist in living out the TRC calls to action. And peace. Right here in Waterloo, support the Peace Research Institute of the Canadian Council of Churches, Project Plowshares. They've led incredible long-term and sustained impact globally and in Canada for regulating the arms trade, responding to humanitarian crises caused by war, and holding governments to account for their actions in emerging military technologies like autonomous drones, the use of artificial intelligence or uses of artificial intelligence, and lethal autonomous weapons. I also invite you to look for an invitation from us to join the President of the Canadian Council of Churches to pray, walk, and give on September 21, the International Day of Prayer for Peace. I invite you to consider circling that in your calendar as a day of walk for peace with the President of the Canadian Council of Churches. So that's what I had prepared, but I just want to return to the bookend of giftedness, gift, gratitude. It all begins and ends with gift and grace, and therefore gratitude. Thank you for the gift of reflecting on these stories and sources and stories of inspiration. Thank you for the gift of nomination and selecting me as the recipient of the award. But most of all, thank you for the community of friendship that makes this work and this movement sing. Thank you.
Peter. This may be the only time in my life, David, so I'm going to. Peter, I wonder, in what ways do you see human dignity under threat in Canada or globally that you would like us to think a little bit more deeply about?
Well, there's the easy ones like, anytime we see and experience racism, someone's essential human dignity is being erased, or when we, see folks in the streets living homeless or suffering from mental illness or in some way not members of the full members of the community, that would be a threat to human dignity. But looking at you, of course, I'm thinking too about the positive and negative sides of artificial intelligence. To what extent does artificial intelligence take away creativity, or does it enhance creativity? If we become too dependent on it, does it somehow undermine our innovation and our sense of ourselves? I think those are relevant, good questions to ask. If we were in a Catholic space here, and maybe for some of you too, then the beginning and end of life, those conversations are super important for them. And it's connected, of course, to that principle of the sacredness of life. Medical assistance in dying, or, yeah.
Picking up on sort of the last large theme that you talked about, white Christian nationalism, do you see any current examples or think that it would be a good idea for Christian mainline communities, just generally across Canada, trying to have a dialogue with those who embrace white Christian nationalism? And we have communities here in Waterloo Region, so we don't have to go looking far for them. Is dialogue possible?
I'm sure dialogue is possible, but some of you know I'm a member of the Christian Reformed Church, and in my classis, which is the gathering of, local, regional gatherings of churches, a couple of the congregations have signed the Niagara Declaration, which is a Christian nationalist declaration. We've never brought it up in that classis meeting. Most people don't even know that congregations have signed off on that declaration. I think if we had that conversation, it would be explosive, even more explosive maybe than the LGBTQ question that's tearing us apart at the moment. So I want to believe that dialogue is possible in most circumstances, and it's a good thing to do. But I think more deeply, I believe that it's more important that we're true to ourselves. When there are opposing points of view, I think it's important to be the best we can be in the work in the direction we want to go that aligns with our faith and our convictions, and to lead by example and not get too distracted by tit for tat and back and forth.
Not to disappoint you, Peter, but thanks for the opportunity to ask you a question, but also thanks for your presentation and your reflections. I think they're very important. I guess I'm interested, though, that the times have changed. Looking back at some of the accomplishments, the churches, particularly today, have been more disestablished than ever before. I think there's more cynicism about churches and what they can contribute, and there's more suspicion, I think, too, about churches and religious people, more generally speaking. So I think there's some challenges that you mentioned in your presentation a bit. But what are the obstacles within the churches to some of the kind of nation building or international projects that you're talking about supporting, like the Jubilee Initiative or peace? What are some of the roadblocks that churches themselves need to address to move forward on some of these things?
That sounds like a David Frimmer question, all right. Two things come to mind. In our case for support in our fundraising campaign, trying to figure out who we are as the Canadian Council of Churches, I found myself with this phrase that the Christians are the largest social movement in Canada. 51% of the population, 13,500 worshiping communities. What does that mean exactly is a good question. But I don't think we should be underestimating, our legacy and capacity and resources in many, many ways. We're still the Christian community, faith communities in general, are still an enormous force for change. And we shouldn't downplay that by seeing, smaller communities of worshipers and churches across the country. I think it's still a huge factor. Then the other thing, what about, the bigger nation building or international things that we've been involved in the past? Does that still have currency today? And I have noticed that, let's say the ecumenical gaze, when we do those priority setting exercises, doesn't extend too far. It has to work hard to get up to something Canadian and not so much global. If we're having conversations about, what the World Council of Churches should do, then not so many people come to those meetings. So I think times have changed that way. Poverty and anti-racism work, truth and reconciliation, that's something we can see in the neighborhood down the street. But the bigger questions about, well, how should Canada respond to the situation in Gaza? Or how should Canada respond to the trade agreements threats from south of the border? Those conversations are a little harder to have. We don't have the same research staff capacity in the churches that we used to. Probably does it. Yeah, thank you.
Yes. Is this on? Yeah. Oh, okay. Sorry. My question is going to probably follow the same theme as the rest, but first of all, thank you for your presentation. Thank you for all you've contributed over the years. This is a very appropriate honor. I guess I wanted to ask, well, let me tell you what I see as a real challenge right now that we have in this country, and see if you agree and if there is a role for voices of faith. And that is that we are in such a strange time right now because of the threat from the South that we seem to feel that a whole bunch of issues we can just set aside. That climate change, we don't have the luxury of dealing with it. And tied to it, we've seen in the media today, proper consultation with Indigenous people. We don't have time because of Donald Trump. Defense, forget 2%, we need to go to 5%. Why do we need to go to 5? Because of Donald Trump. And I guess I may be coming at this from a different angle. It's not about necessarily the solutions to these, is the fact that to actually say to Canadians, you know what, we can actually take a deep breath and maybe start to even look at these things from a different perspective, or our old way of looking at them, to at least ask some questions and do it when there seems to be this sense of urgency that because of Donald Trump, we can't have those debates and discussions. So I don't know, you're nodding your head whether you agree with that analysis, and do voices of faith. Even as I say, maybe not, I'm not necessarily pointing in one direction or another, but even to tell the whole world that we can take a breath, that we can maybe think about healthcare. We had a provincial election campaign that was fought on tariffs. I mean, like, that's weird for me, and not on healthcare when we have a healthcare system that's under crisis. I think of Joe Gunn's book and the amazing chapter about the work you did. So do you think we can, faith communities can kind of, I don't know, send electroshocks to the country that we should all take a breath?
I don't know how charged the faith communities are to deliver that shock. That there is huge capacity, and I think there are possibilities, but there are two things that to me are still important. One is many folks have forgotten the histories, right? So I think it's important we research and research and retell the stories that we know, and that becomes part of who we are, and that we can pass on to other folks who are connecting for justice again, to help raise the sights of what's possible. The other thing, though, that I think has changed on the global scene is that, authoritarianism and populist governments around the world have changed the international order. The rise of those more populist and authoritarian governments. So, when we might have worked before with the UN in a more collaborative, cooperative way, that doesn't work that way anymore. So I think we do need to kind of come to terms with what a new populist authoritarian international order means and how we respond to that. I don't think that we've done enough work and reflection on what that means. But just to return in Canada, can we take a breath and return to some of the other more salient long-term issues? I'm sure that will come back. Yeah.
I want to say thank you, Peter, for your lifetime of work on behalf of all of us in making a wide trail that some of us can join into, because in the ways some people know it, a first skidoo has to break the trail, and the one who breaks the trail works the hardest, but then everybody afterwards can follow in the pathway. Thank you for that. I'm also thinking about Storferson, and I think Henriette will agree that your contribution in Sweden at the Great Rapids made an incredible transformation there, when you, as a very empowered leader, permitted in the concept that picking berries could be considered sacred. You changed a circumpolar conversation when you permitted that, when you gave that concept that people were hoping for, when you gave that hope. And I think of you as sometimes relative to a prism, that you're always trying to get the prism close to the light, because when a prism is in the light, then it sends all this ray energy out, and all sorts of people can shine. That's what you do. You make sure it's in the light. And no, I'm just being honest. I'm wondering, because you have so many university and college related people here tonight, if there's something that you see moving forward in the Canadian Council of Churches relative to your moving intergenerational justice and peace work into the light, your work with young adults, particularly in the Canadian Council of Churches. You're encouraging us time and again to get people to be doing research and remembering stories. What vision do you have for bringing forward next generations and connecting that with campuses and campus work, academic work?
Thanks for that question, Karen. Last year, I did a little work reflecting on the story of the Canadian Council of Churches and how I came to be connected to it. And one of the things I discovered doing that little research for a course I took was that maybe the role of the Canadian Council of Churches, for example, as a place that brings together faith communities for common action and reflection and so on, that maybe the program work is not so important after all, but that it's really a place of socialization, that it passes on a way of thinking, a way of doing, a way of reflecting, a way of acting, and theologically, a way of organizing that gets passed on to the next people who show up at that table almost through osmosis or almost through some invisible socialization thing. And that 80 years of the Canadian Council of Churches convening tables around topics that folks cared about, not so much about the topics or whatever advocacy goals we might have had, but just to continue to pass on a way of dialogue, a way of being open, a pastoral tone of acceptance, a way of working through difference or putting up with difference, that those are all way more important than whatever program work we do. So I don't know if that's really true, but that certainly got me reflecting about what the value is of something like the Canadian Interfaith Conversation or the Canadian Council of Churches as an enduring table. I imagine the Interfaith Grand River folks would have a similar experience to that. For example, here. In terms of young adults, it is true the Canadian Council of Churches has been working for some 5 years to refocus our resources on inviting in and joining youth and young adults where they are in their faith journey. We're slowly making some changes there, but I dare not predict where that's going because it needs to be in hand and is in the hands of the young adults themselves. And I'm mainly interested in staying out of the way and finding enough resources so that they can continue to do that themselves. They'll pull down some of those socialization processes that we've all experienced around tables of cooperation in their own way. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk, and it's been inspiring to listen to you and also to participate in the exercises that you gave us. So thank you for that. We live in a real dicey political climate, and I'm very aware that political forces will use those things that are very important to us, identity, religion, whatever, to divide us.
Mm.
And so I'm just wondering how you discern, whether to, I'm Jewish, but do I, and it's very hard to know how to present myself as a Jew in this climate without, well, obviously.
Yep.
I also am I'm part of an interfaith family, and I have very devout, faithful Christians in my family too. So a lot of times when I hear people just spouting off and categorizing certain people as, oh, they're religious fanatics, or they're right-wing Christians, or they're this or that, or they're Zionists, or they're, it really is divisive, and it does not help foster communication, nor does it increase any integrity or honesty in community. So how do you discern when and how to talk about things religious?
Good question. Just thinking of an experience of a meeting of the executive committee of the Canadian Interfaith Conversation that happened, I think, on October 10. So 3 days after the raids. With the representative from the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs and Islamic Relief Canada and the National Council for Canadian Muslims and the Evangelical Fellowship and the Canadian Council of Churches and, the Baha'i community and others from other faith communities. We dropped the whole agenda and we just spent time listening to one another. And coming out of that, we kind of have begun to say that the most important things is patience and courage and continuing to hold one another's hands. That's maybe a kind of a kumbaya thing to say, but I'm kind of a fan of kumbaya stuff. I think that I'm sure that doesn't answer altogether your question, how to figure out when something is being weaponized against you in an unhelpful way. But I guess I prefer to focus on the hand-holding part. Yeah.
Thank you so
Thank you,
much,
Christine.
Peter.
Yeah.
It's been wonderful to have you and to be able to honor your work. And thank you to all of you for being here this evening and to support the celebration. And want to again, Consumer Fund for supporting the global advocacy. There is some refreshments at the back. Please participate. To leave to pick up with the Oilers and the hockey game. The other religious activity that's happening tonight, right? Rooting for the right team, right? Anyways, please help yourself and carry on the conversations. Again, congrats. So wonderful to be able to celebrate